Okay, the next trap we're going to talk about is our paw encapsulating trap, or what we call coon cuffs. And this is one right here that I use all the time. And you can see it's got the trap, it's got a chain, it's got a swivel on the chain, and it has a locking device that I can use for a standoff cable. I just wrap those standoff cables around the tree, lock this dude on, shove this thing in the dirt, bait it up, and it's ready to go. The speed of these traps and the efficiency at catching targeted type animals, which are your smaller predatory animals like your egg eaters, skunks, possums, coons, is unmatched in the trapping world, no question about it. And they're very, very simplistic. The one thing this trap has to have, and now we're getting into a higher arena of trapping, is this trap has to have bait. The conibear, or body grip, and the snare don't rely on bait. They rely on location more than bait. Now, you can bait a body grip trap to get an animal to walk through it. You can bait the other side, things like that, but they're more for blind sets or run sets and things like that than they are, or box sets. And in a box set, you would put some bait inside to get the animal to go into the box. However, for the most part, those traps can be used with no bait whatsoever. So they take less equipment and less forethought and less things like I have to have bait now to get the animal to come to this trap. They rely on location to get the job done. So that's the beginning. Now we're getting into something we have to have bait for. So let's talk about how this trap works. Basically, you have a canister here that has a lever inside of it that moves back and forth right here at the top. And you have a dog here that swings into the trigger, basically, so that when the trigger is pulled, it releases this trigger, which releases this spring. And the spring has basically a U on the bottom of it to handcuff the animal's foot or paw inside this trap so that he can't get away. And you stake it into the ground, and then you chain it to something so he can't go anywhere. He's going to be alive when you get there for sure. Bear that in mind if you catch a skunk, okay? So how we set this trap is very, very simple. We're going to squeeze down on that spring and push the dog over the top and hold the dog just like that in our hand. Swing the lever back and push it over the top just like that. Now the trap is set. Anything that pulls on this from underneath on the inside, so you're going to put food bait inside here. What I find works very well is just corn and cat food mixed up in a jar together, thrown in there, a little bit of fish oil on the trail or whatever where you're trying to get the animal to come to this trap, maybe a little fish oil on the outside of the trap. He's going to be there. They can't resist it. So now this trap is set. Again, this is a trap that you could carry into the woods set. However, banging it around is probably going to knock that dog off the trigger. So what do guys do to circumvent that? I'll show you. What you can do is take a piece of 3/4 inch PVC and stick it in that tube so that when this thing releases, there we go. I was pushing against the trigger. It's a pull trigger. Now, you only have to squeeze this spring down a short ways to set this trap, and you cut that piece of PVC off about right here. That gives you the ability to carry this trap virtually preset. The reason you want to do that is because any of these things that have springs that you have to manipulate in cold weather, if you don't have assisting setting type tools, it becomes a pain when you're out on the line. So having them in a semi-preset or preset position makes your job much faster and easier when you're out in that cold weather on the line, because all this stuff can be done at the line shack, in the shed, in the cabin, in the house, in the garage, whatever, before you go out on the trap line. So real quick before we move on, let's talk about the difference between what I would call a paw encapsulating trap, which was this trap that we just looked at, and a foothold, which is the next trap we're going to look at. Remember that this trap is called a dog proof because it takes an animal that has articulating fingers to get in there and be able to try to pull bait out to set that trigger off. And there's been many, many times, believe it or not, I've caught coons with both hands in that thing at the same time. They'll get both of their arms in there and they'll go to dig and try to pull that bait out to their mouth, and they'll get both hands locked in that trap at the same time. I've had it happen on multiple occasions. Even though that hole's only about this big around, a coon has no problem getting both front feet in there to dig that food out. And it's going to trap them in the forearm. That's why I say it's a paw encapsulating trap. It's going to catch their whole front of their leg in there a lot of times, not just the pad of their foot. That's the difference. But because it's a dog-proof trap, pretty much cat-proof, I've never seen a cat catching one either. It may happen, but I've never seen it. The point is, if you're using these traps around a domestic area where you're trying to eliminate predatory animals around chicken coops and things like that, or gardens, that kind of stuff, or coming up eating cat food off your porch, these type traps will catch those animals without catching your domestics. Okay, so now we're going to move into what I would call foothold type traps. And the first one we're going to talk about is a double long spring. And again, these traps are made to capture the animal's foot. The distance between this pan and the top of these jaws is how much of that animal is going to be in the trap. So you can see this trap here is fairly small. This is for like a raccoon in a water set. And there's probably 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches of space right here. And a raccoon's paw is that long, okay? So when he puts his paw in there and trips that trap, he's gonna have his paw in there. It's not a leg hold type trap. The only way you're gonna get an animal's leg in this thing is if you accidentally trapped a mink in here or something maybe. You might get deep on his leg. But if your intention is to catch coons in a water set and that's what you're trapping for, you're most likely not gonna catch a mink in a trap like this, although it can happen. So there are no absolutes in trapping. There's no question about that. But you can use certain traps for certain things with the intention of not catching non-target species. So let's talk about this trap for a minute. Again, same rules apply. We have a spring-loaded device, just like we had on every other trap, that closes these jaws. And you have 2 jaws that close here. These are non-offset jaws. We'll talk about offset jaws in a minute. You have a pan, and you have basically a dog right here that catches on the pan. And so you lift this up into the dog with the jaws underneath it, and that's what sets the trap. So let's take this down on the stump real quick and look at it. Same rules apply. We got a trap chain on here. This has got 2 swivels. 1 swivel mid-chain, 1 swivel at the end of the chain. We got 2 swivels on this trap, all right? Coons and things like that tend to thrash around a lot, mess around a lot, wrap around a lot of things, so it's good to have more swivels on those type traps. Now, a trap like this can have either a spring on one side, like a conibear has a spring on one side on a 110, or it can have springs on both sides like this one does, which is the difference between a single long spring and a double long spring. Double long springs obviously going to give you more power, more closing power, and the traps are usually numbered, and the numbers don't make any sense in the world anymore. But I think this is a number 2 Victor. This is an older trap. Now, a coil spring trap, on the other hand, has coiled springs that operate those levers. Instead of having a spring-loaded device here, this lever is spring-loaded to close these jaws. And this one has offset jaws. It's a coyote trap. And these have offset jaws in them so that when they clamp down on the pad, they're really not clamping down on the bone. They're clamping around the bone and just capturing the pad in there. And again, if you look at this trap, the distance between this pan going off, being level, and the top of this trap is probably 2.5 inches. And a dog's foot is pretty big. I've never caught a coyote on one of these traps that had his whole leg in the trap. It's always his foot. Sometimes it's a little deeper. Sometimes it's a little more shallow. Sometimes you catch him by those first set of pads. Sometimes you catch him right below in that palm pad area. But catching them right between those two is the optimum catch in a trap like this, okay? Let's go down to the stump and we'll look about setting these type of traps. Okay, so let's talk about setting these traps. Now, one thing that we didn't talk about was sensitivity on these traps and how hard they have to step on the trap to set it off. These older traps don't have a lot of leeway as far as setting the pan tension of the trap. You can bend this up a little bit to push that dog further into the pan, and that gives you a little bit more, or you can pull it back to make it a lighter trigger. But newer traps have a screw device in here, in here where the pan's at, that will actually tighten that pan, so it's harder to push it down. Again, looking at this from a non-target species animal, if you're looking at this to catch something large, you want more pan tension on that thing, so he's actually got to commit his weight to it. That way, if something stumbles into your trap set that's lighter weight than your pan tension allows the trap to be set off, you don't catch a non-target animal. A coyote or a bobcat is going to commit to that trap. They're going to put the full weight of their paw right in that thing, trying to get their nose in a hole. Or digging. You're not going to have to worry too much about that. So when you're going to set these traps, what you have to do is you have to, number one, move the dog out of the way. And then you need to compress these springs down on both sides, just like this, and open the jaws. And then you can hold the trap by the frame and the jaw to keep it open. All right, this is called the strong jaw. This is the one that's being held in place by the dog, which is keeping this spring from popping up and closing this trap. This is called the weak jaw. So when we get this trap set, when we come in here and push this in and push that pan up on top of that dog, just like that, we've got it set in place. Now we can relax. This jaw will move and articulate. That's why it's called the weak jaw. The strong jaw is the one that won't move. And then you can adjust these springs forward toward the strong jaw so that the weak jaw will lay flat. If you don't do that, your weak jaw is not going to lay very flat in the set. It's going to be poked up. So you've got to adjust these forward a little bit like this to drop that weak jaw. And now, when the animal comes in and steps on the pan, his foot is caught in the trap. Okay, just like that. It's that simple. Now, a coil spring, on the other hand, and this one does have a bolt in the pan that you can see right here that makes that pan either harder or less hard to push up and down. All right, so a coil spring trap basically uses springs to lift these levers up, and the lever itself is not a spring. And so you have two coils here, and sometimes you have four coils. You have two on this side and two on this side. Obviously, 4 coils is stronger than 2. 2 long springs is stronger than 1. But I've never found a single coil spring that wouldn't hold a coyote yet, especially one this size. So what you have to do with these is you have to, again, get the dog out of your way, and you have to push these arms down and open jaws. Once you do that, you can, again, hold that jaw down with your hands and push that dog over the top, slide that pan over the dog, and again, you have a weak jaw and a strong jaw, but you don't have to move anything out of the way for that trap to lay flat. Now, you can get this weak jaw up, and as long as you're operating underneath this weak jaw, you can't get caught in the trap. Then you can come in here and you can level this pan out or click it to a night latch. It would have a night latch on it, which is just a step in that trigger so that you know the pan's level, even in the dark, and it's just about ready to go off. That's just about level right there. Now, if I set this trap off with my hand underneath this weak jaw, let me get my hand out of the way of the spring moving up. You'll see my hands aren't in the trap. If I go inside those jaws to mess around, then my hand's inside the trap, and if it goes off, my hand's gonna be in the trap as well. Not gonna be pleasant on a trap this size, for sure, okay? They make devices you can use to slide over these that extend the length of these to get leverage on them, to set them easier. I generally just wear gloves and set them in the field. But again, that's one of the disadvantages of traps like this is you have to set these on location. You can't preset them like you can some other traps. Now, traps like this have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of these traps is you can use these anywhere. You can use these in the water. You can use them on land. It doesn't really matter. However, on land, you're better off probably with something like this. It takes up less footprint in the ground for a trap bed than big, long springs folded backwards, especially something big enough to catch a coyote in. But I have caught bobcats in a double long spring trap. I have videos on it on my channel. So they'll catch anything. There's just better application for these traps depending on what they are and where you're trapping and what you're trapping. Okay, so now let's talk about live traps or cage traps. And they make these traps from small enough for squirrel to big enough for things like hogs, even big enough for things like bear, depending on what you're trying to catch. Live traps are good in the fact that, number one, the animal is always going to be alive when you get there, and if you get a non-target species, you can always relocate or release. The problem with a live trap is they take up a lot of room to carry them around, and you have to get the animal to go inside the trap, which is sometimes more difficult, but you have to camouflage that to think he's going in some kind of a den or a hole sometimes, and he's in a hide more than he's going into a box, because it's difficult sometimes to get them to do that unless you just overpower their sense of feed and they go in there to eat and they really don't care. But camouflaging these traps is important. We'll talk about that when we talk about setting these traps. Right now, we're just talking about the mechanisms themselves and how they set and operate. So let's look at one of these on the table. Okay, so I've got this trap in this set position right now. And basically you have a swinging door here on the front of the trap. You have an L bar here that's holding that door open. It comes over here and bends into another L that's got a piece of tubing on it or a hole in it that the pan rod slides up into. so that it can't move. When the animal walks into the trap, when the animal goes into the trap, and generally the bait will be back in here somewhere, and steps on the pan, he drops the door. The door slams down, it's spring loaded, so it can't open back up, and the animal's in the cage. So what you do with this is you push this spring-loaded mechanism, has a latch on it here. You pick that up and swing that backwards and lift the door up. You then take this bar and you rotate it on the door so it's holding the door up. You take the pan rod and lift it up to the hole, lifting up the pan and setting the trap. And again, all it takes is for the pan to be pushed down by pressure, and the animal's going to be caught inside the trap. They're very, very effective, easy traps to use. They're great traps for around a homestead and things like that, for predatory animals that are getting into your chicken coop, things like that, or your garden, because again, if you choose to, you can live release that animal somewhere else and get him away from your property, or you can have animal control or a nuisance trapper come and pick him up, or a nuisance trapper will come out probably and set a cage like this for you and take the animal away at a certain cost, whatever that is for that trapper. Okay, so that's live traps, and they all work virtually the same way. They have a pan, they have a bar that holds the door up. When the pan's pushed down, the door falls, and the animal's stuck inside. Again, lots of volume here. So it would take the whole back of a four-wheeler to put 12 of these in, where I could put 12 coon cuffs in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket and have room for 20 more.